The webinar is now live on Facebook.
Good morning, everyone on Facebook. We will be with you in just a moment. We are just letting a few more attendees into the press conference, and we will be starting shortly for the Rusesabagina family press conference to talk about the fact that humanitarian Paul Rusesabagina has now been illegally held in Rwanda for 1 month. Kevin, just let me know when we are ready to go. Thank you. And we are hearing from a couple of people in chat that they were not able to hear us. If anyone in the chat is having trouble still, could you please send us a note in chat if any of the attendees are having trouble hearing us? Thank you very much. We are now live to Facebook at Free Paul Rusesabagina Facebook channel.
Okay, you can go ahead and begin, Kitty. Thank you very much.
Good morning. How is everyone this morning? Thank you so much for joining us for the press conference from the Rusesabagina family to talk about the fact that humanitarian Paul Rusesabagina has now been illegally held in Rwanda for more than 30 days. Today, we are going to hear from the press, from the family and from the legal team to talk about this situation. Paul speaks often about how during the Rwandan genocide, he reached out to the world to let them know what was going on in Rwanda. And he felt like no one heard him, that the international community did not respond. Today, we need the international community to hear about Paul's situation and to respond. We are going to go through, we'll be hearing from Brian Endless, from Paul's children, and from Peter Robinson. And then at the end of the press conference, we will be taking questions from the media. At the bottom right-hand portion of your screen, there's a box called Q&A. You can put your questions in there and your name and media outlet, and we will address the questions at the end of the press conference after the statements. And now we would like to begin. Professor Brian Endless from Loyola University in Chicago, please kick us off.
Thank you, Kitty, and thank you all for joining us. Sadly, the fact that the Kagame regime in Rwanda has kidnapped and brought false charges against Paul Rusesabagina is nothing new. I've been a friend and colleague of Paul's for almost 15 years now, and Rwandan government harassment was a nonstop activity since I have known him. Rwandan President Paul Kagame is a dictator, and he does not tolerate any dissent inside or outside of Rwanda. And Paul Rusesabagina is a humanitarian who has always been unafraid to point out the many human rights violations and abuses of Kagame's government. This has led to harassment, threats, and a long history of false charges since 1996. Paul was still in Rwanda in 1996 when this started. He was a well-known Hutu who wouldn't sign on with the Tutsi-dominated government. He was offered a number of positions and he refused them. That made him an enemy of Kagame and finally led to an assassination attempt, after which Paul and his family had to flee to Belgium. Threats continued and picked up, especially after the release of Hotel Rwanda in 2004, as Paul Rusesabagina now had an international platform. He was seen as a hero in the international community. He received the United States Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he started speaking out loudly and often against human rights abuses of the Kagame government. This led to constant harassment from that time forward. Rwandan agents, including ambassadors, followed Paul to almost every public appearance he made, whether in the United States or Europe or anywhere around the world. As just one example, on the day that I personally met Paul for the first time in 2007, the Rwandan ambassador to the US was on a panel with him. It forced his way onto the panel, and that Rwandan ambassador accused Paul of meeting with 2 United States ambassadors in South Africa to run guns to rebels in the Congo. It was a loud accusation, and there was absolutely no proof behind it whatsoever. Paul's home was invaded twice by Rwandan agents. He had multiple death threats over the years, and now this culminated in his kidnapping and his illegal imprisonment for the last month in Rwanda. We want to start off today by being very clear that this is nothing new, but rather standard operating procedures by Paul Kagame's Rwandan government against any dissenter, and especially, unfortunately, against Paul Rusesabagina. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We will now hear from Paul's youngest daughter, Corinne Kanimba, to kick us off.
So our family has been devastated and shocked at what has happened to our father. The kidnapping, the illegal detention has brought a huge toll on our lives. Has turned our entire lives upside down. We have to first be clear that our father is a Belgian citizen. He arrived in Belgium in 1996, first as a political refugee. The Belgian authorities granted him the status of a political refugee, and by doing that, agreed to protect him from the persecution he was receiving in Rwanda. In 1999, he became a Belgian citizen. He became a Belgian citizen, and back in the time, Rwanda didn't allow dual citizenship. So he became a Belgian citizen and only a Belgian citizen. He has over the years, as Brian mentioned, over the years we continue to receive threats and harassment from the Rwandan government. My father complained to the Belgians when they broke into our home, when they tried to take his life. When we feared for our lives after they broke into our home, we complained, and so the Belgian authorities know this very well, have been following the harassment that my father has felt by the hands of the Rwandan government. So we asked the Belgian authorities to protect its citizen and to bring him home as quickly as possible. But we also want to thank the European Union signatories of the 27 signatories of the letter. We thank you for your support. However, we also want actions behind those words.
Thank you very much, Corinne. We appreciate you. Trésor, could we hear from you now about what you're feeling and thinking about your father being gone now for 1 month?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about our dad, our father.
Could you speak up just a bit, Trésor?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you better now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'll just speak about my father and who he is and who he's always been a little bit. So our dad has always been the best father that any son or daughter could ever ask for. We grew up with him teaching us about life at a very young age, about calmness in the midst of some of the worst storms, like the genocide. He's always taught us that violence was never the answer for anything, and words were always our strongest weapons, that we could use those words to fight things like injustice, oppression, or just to make people feel better, feel loved and accepted. Not only did he say those things, but we watched him and grew up watching him do those things. He practiced exactly what he preached. We saw him not only stand up to guys with guns and machetes with his words, but we saw him take on an entire government after that, one that violated its people, oppressed them. And when they preyed on those people's fears and silenced them, My dad stood up and spoke up for them. This is who he is. This is why they took him from us. It's why we are now standing up for him, because he would have done the same thing for us, for every one of you. So to the media, every word out of you, every word that you write matters. It'll either bury him in a cage, it might save him. So just be mindful of what you hear from that regime. Be mindful of what they make dad do or say. This is the same regime whose president imprisoned its last political opponent, as well as her innocent mother, and then went on to win by 99% of the votes. 99%. This regime has already lied about how it snatched my dad into Rwanda and has struggled to even explain it. So understand that dad is now surrounded by people who want to see him fall. From the gunmen around him to the people who pretend to be his lawyers, he's fighting alone out there. So I repeat, my dad has always stood up for those who couldn't. He's always spoke up for those who had no voice. And today he's the one without a voice. He's the one who's voiceless, and we will be his voice. And we won't stop until he's home. So, yeah.
Thank you, Trezor. Anais Kanimba, can we hear from you next?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining this press conference and for listening to us and giving us this chance to tell us what's been happening to our family over the last month. As Trezor said, Dad has always used his words to fight for evil, to fight for injustice, and for the loved ones. And today we're also using our words to get him back from from Kigali, from his illegal imprisonment. And we've been doing that working with the United States government here, with the State Department and representatives and senators who are listening to us. So we are using our voice to tell them what's happening to our father. And we believe that they're starting to hear us because they've expressed their concerns. They're concerned about what's happening, the illegal imprisonment of my father, the kidnapping that has happened. And they're pressing the Rwandan government to also allow my father to get his legal representation of choosing, even though he was kidnapped there to begin with. So we are working with the United States and also other opinion leaders and in the United States and also in Europe with the EU and the Belgian government to really use our voice to tell them what's happened to our father in the hopes that we get as much support as we can. And we're happy to say that we've started getting some support, but we're calling out to you guys, you journalists, who can help us, let them know of all these things that we're talking about, who can help us communicate this information for them to put more pressure on Kigali and to release my father as soon as possible.
Thank you, Anais. Next, we'll hear from Diane Rusesabagina, who I think is going to talk to us not only in English, but also in Dutch for the Dutch speakers in our audience today. Diane?
Goeiedag, mijn naam is Diane. Ik ben dochter van Rusesabagina Paul. Mijn vader, onze vader van onze 6, is illegaal gekidnapt, ontvoerd naar Rwanda. Het land dat hij over 26 jaar gevlucht heeft. En momenteel hebben we nog geen enkele momenten kunnen hebben om hem te kunnen spreken via telefoon of toch iets te mogen hebben van hem, communicatie, ook via zijn advocaat. Hij mag geen advocaat kiezen. De familie heeft voor hem een team advocaten gekozen voor hem te kunnen daaruit te halen, maar dat heeft nog niks. Hij heeft verteld in de media dat hij 3 dagen of meer feitelijk in toestand gehouden geweest, dat hij niet kon zien of spreken. Zijn handen en benen waren allemaal gebonden. En hij kon niks zien. Zijn hoofd was ook gedurende 4 dagen gekapt geweest. Momenteel, we weten met zekerheid dat hij met zijn gezondheidstoestand problemen heeft. Hij mag zijn medicijnen niet pakken. En hij was 3 keer of meer naar het ziekenhuis gevoerd geweest. En wij vragen feitelijk dat hij nog we vragen aandacht als familie dat hij veilig naar België teruggestuurd wordt, want hij is Belg. We zijn hier al 26 jaar en we zijn legaal, we zijn Belgen. En hij heeft als enkel fout gemaakt dat hij spreekt over de problemen dat er zijn in Rwanda. En hij is de beschermer van de mensen die geen bescherming hebben. Hij is een stem voor mensen die geen stem niet meer hebben, want in Rwanda mag het niks gezegd worden. En als familie, we zijn enorm ongerust over zijn gezondheidstoestand. We zien in de media, op de foto's, hoe dat hij eruit ziet. Elke keer dat we hem zien, hij ziet er helemaal anders uit. En zijn huidskleur, zijn gezondheidstoestand is duidelijk, of meer dan duidelijk, verslechterd. En we hebben nog geen enkel bewijs dat hij behandeld is, gelijk dat het zou moeten. Dus we vragen dat zijn rechten in acht gebracht worden en dat hij veilig naar huis kan terugkomen. Als familie, we zijn enorm ongerust over hem. En dat is wat ik kan zeggen voor het moment. Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, Diane. And next we will hear from Roger Rusesabagina, who I think is going to share some of his thoughts, not only in English, but also in Kinyarwanda for our Kinyarwanda audience.
Thank you, Kitty. Like you said, I'm going to speak in Kinyarwanda so that our Rwandese listeners and friends and supporters can hear what we have to say. Nk'uko mwari mubizi, hashize igihe kirenga ukwezi umubyeyi wacu bamushimuse bakaba baramujyanye i Kigali. Ari ibintu tutari twiteguye, ariko twagira ngo dushimire abanyarwanda n'abanyamahanga bose bari kudufasha muri uru rugamba, kuko ntabwo ari urugamba rworoshye. Nawe mu gihe cyo nagira ngo abantu benshi cyane abanyarwanda bamenye nuko uru rugamba si urwacu twenyine. Harimo ibintu kuba u Rwanda rushobora kugenda rukajya gukidnapa abantu i Dubai cyangwa mu Bubiligi si bishya, kandi ntabwo bizarangira ahangaha. Uburyo abanyarwanda twese tugomba guhaguruka tukarurwana uru rugamba, kandi n'abantu bose bo ku isi, kuko kuba impunzi, ubundi icyo umuntu abaga impunzi wava mu gihugu cyawe bakaguha amahoro, ariko ubu ngubu kuba impunzi ntabwo bikugarantisa amahoro niba waba uri mu gihugu, waba uri muri Amerika cyangwa i Burayi cyangwa muri Congo. Rero kugira ngo ibi bintu bihagarare, abanyarwanda twese tugomba kumenyesha amahanga ko ibintu abanyarwanda basinye amategeko mpuzamahanga avuga ko bagomba guproteje impunzi. Natwe tugomba kwibutsa ayo mahanga ko u Rwanda rwari rwasinye amategeko kandi ibyo bintu bitemewe kandi bigomba guhanirwa n'amategeko mpuzamahanga. Umubyeyi wacu, ntabwo mvuga byinshi, bari umunange babivuze mu Cyongereza no mu Gifaransa, ariko abamuzi benshi, abanyarwanda bose bamuzi, bazi ko ari umugabo w'intwari, bazi ko ari umuntu udatorera ibintu by'akajagari, ari umuntu ukunda abantu bose. Abanyarwanda benshi bageze iwacu, aba mu Bubiligi cyangwa muri Amerika. Hari umuntu uvuga ngo iyo ugeze iwacu wajya muri ONI, ko ari abantu b'amoko yose, abantu bakomoka abantu bose, ku buryo kuba yashimuswa ko ari kuregwa ibyo ibibazo ibyaha bari kumushinja bidafite aho bishingiye. Ibyo byaha babizanye mu Bubiligi umwaka ushize, kandi Ababiligi babona ko ibyaha nta hantu bishingiye, bidafite ishingiro, ariko urwo rubanza ntirurarangira. Ni nk'uko u Rwanda rugomba gukurikira amategeko nk'ibindi bihugu byose, niba uko u Rwanda rwareze abantu muri Amerika no mu Burayi, abanyamerika ko ibyo bintu bifite aho bishingiye, bafasha abantu babohereza. Ni ukuvuga ko na papa bagiye kumurega mu Bubiligi umwaka ushize, bazana ibyo birego, Ababiligi barabyexamina basanga nta bazi bifite, ku rubanza ntirurarangira. nk'uko wari gukina n'umuntu umupira wabona utangiye gutsindwa ukavuga utega nce rwanda muvuna akaguru. Ntabwo ibyo byemewe n'amategeko. Bari ku rubanza rw'umubiri rurangire, twe turasaba ko umubyeyi wacu bamusubiza mu Bubiligi akagera kuburanirayo kuko bamuzanye mu buryo butemewe n'amategeko kandi mu buryo butemewe n'amategeko kandi urubanza rwari rutararangira, nta nubwo nta rubanza nta n'ishinge byari bifite. Ibi biba muri Recessive bishya ni ibintu bimaze imyaka myinshi. Tumaze imyaka 24 mu buhungiro. Mu myaka 24 tumaze mu buhungiro ntitwigeze tugira amahoro ku buryo ushobora gusinzira uvuga uti nanjye ndi ahantu ndi kure y'u Rwanda ndasinziriye. Uzi ko nta cyaha bakoze, ari jyewe ari barumuna banjye ari ababyeyi, nta cyaha bigeze bakora. Icyo wabasinza nuko bafashije abantu igihe abantu bari bakenewe gufashwa, none tukaba turi kubyishyura. Ubu ngubu tumaze 24 tubyishyura. Ibyo bintu bigomba guhagarara kandi abanyarwanda bose bagomba guhagarara, kandi menshi bari kudusapotinga, nabyo turabishimira cyane. Murakoze. Thanks, Kitty.
Thank you. Thank you. You didn't hear my attempt to say thank you in Kinyarwanda, so that was good. Now we'll hear from Paul's eldest daughter, Lise Rusesabagina, and then we will hear from Peter Robinson on the legal front. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom right-hand portion of your screen, and let us know which media outlet you're with, and we will take all the questions. And as you've seen, Paul has immensely talented children, so we can take your questions in English, en français, in Dutch, and also in Kinyarwanda. So just let us know, put them in the Q&A function. And now Lise Rusesabagina, thank you.
Bonjour, je suis Lise Rusesabagina et aujourd'hui nous sommes très inquiets du sort qu'on réserve à notre père. Notre papa, qui est un père bon et un grand-père, a été kidnappé, ligoté, bandé des yeux et amené à Kigali sans qu'il le veuille, contre sa volonté, par le pouvoir sanguinaire du président Kagame, le grand dictateur du monde. Et il a été pris en otage pendant 4 jours. Il a été torturé. Et il est maintenant détenu dans une prison centrale à Kigali, illégalement. Nous sommes inquiets quant à sa santé parce qu'il prenait chaque jour un médicament, mais il est resté toute une semaine sans rien prendre et il a été transporté à l'hôpital pendant 3 fois. Et aujourd'hui, on ne sait pas... On sait rien de sa santé, il n'y a aucun bilan et on lui parle, mais pas vraiment, il n'est pas à l'aise pour parler, il dit des choses qu'il n'aurait pas dit dans les conditions normales. Ce n'est pas la personne qu'on connaît et normalement c'est quelqu'un qui est connu pour dire ce qu'il pense, c'est quelqu'un qui est vrai, qui est droit. Et parce qu'il oppose le pouvoir, parce qu'il critique ce qu'est fait son pouvoir sanguinaire, il a tout simplement été enlevé et maltraité. Aujourd'hui, nous demandons au pouvoir international d'agir, notamment à la Belgique. Nous insistons sur le fait qu'il soit belge et non rwandais, comme le prétendent les autorités rwandaises. Il n'est pas du tout rwandais parce qu'il a renoncé à la nationalité rwandaise le jour où il a reçu le droit d'asile parce qu'il a remis son passeport rwandais et sa carte d'identité rwandaise à l'ONU. Et depuis ce jour, il n'est pas du tout rwandais comme ils le prétendent. Et ils ont été le chercher à Dubaï parce qu'ils pensaient qu'il était rwandais. Donc, il bafoue tout simplement les droits internationaux. Et je reviens sur sa maladie car ils ont fait une prise de sang. On a parlé avec lui, il nous a dit qu'on lui a fait une prise de sang. On n'est pas sûr de ce qu'ils ont injecté à notre papa parce que ces maladies sont connues depuis longtemps. Il a des médecins qui le traitent depuis un bon moment et ces médecins disent que s'il reste pendant un certain temps sans rien prendre comme médicament, c'est normal que la tension monte et aussi vu la situation dans laquelle il s'est retrouvé, c'est normal. Donc, on lui a envoyé des médicaments et ces médicaments ont été confisqués. Maintenant, on ne sait pas s'il prend les médicaments que nous lui avons envoyés ou s'il prend les médicaments qu'eux, ils veulent qu'il prenne. Donc, ça, c'est une chose. Une deuxième chose sur laquelle nous sommes extrêmement inquiets, on lui a refusé l'accès aux avocats. Nous avons choisi un groupe d'avocats, un groupe professionnel, un groupe international. On lui a donné 2 avocats commis d'office qui ne savent rien faire en tant qu'avocats, qui ne savent même pas le droit. C'est honteux pour le maître Rugaza, qui ne sait même pas expliquer les droits sur la nationalité, que papa intervienne lui-même. Nous insistons sur le fait qu'on n'a jamais légitimé ces 2 avocats-là qui sont tout le temps debout à côté de papa, mais qui ne l'aident même pas. Nous insistons sur le fait qu'on lui laisse choisir ses avocats de 1 et de 2, que la Belgique le ramène à la maison parce qu'il n'est pas rwandais, il n'a pas à être là, il est détenu illégalement. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Lise. Très bien. And that leads us to Peter Robinson, who I think will reiterate some of Lisa's important points about the fact that the lawyers that say that they are representing Paul are not really legitimate choices. And I think that leads us directly into comments from Peter Robinson. Can you please talk to us about the legal issues?
Thank you very much, Kitty. I'm Peter Robinson. I'm a former assistant United States attorney. I've been defending people at international criminal courts and tribunals for the last 20 years, including at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. I'm the lead lawyer for a group of lawyers that include lawyers from the United States, Belgium, Rwanda, Australia, and Canada. The abduction of Paul Rusesabagina was illegal under international law. A country must obtain custody of foreign nationals through extradition or deportation. The Rwandan government did neither. Paul Rusesabagina cannot receive a fair trial in Rwanda. His case is the most recent in a series of prosecutions of President Kagame's political opponents. In the cases of the last 2 political opponents, the East African Court of Human Rights and the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention have expressly found that those 2 women, Victoire Ingabire and Diane Rwigara, did not receive a fair trial in Rwanda. And in a country where the elections are rigged by arresting opponents and garnering 99% of the vote, Paul's trial is being rigged as well by placing government-sponsored lawyers to masquerade as defense counsel so that, like the elections, there is only one possible outcome. Right now, the Rwandan government is funding Paul's defense team when he has the funds to hire his own lawyers. This is unprecedented among national legal aid systems around the world. This is how they are preventing Paul from being defended by lawyers of his own choice and who are independent of the Rwandan government. Those lawyers include Gatera Gashabana, the former president of the Rwandan Bar Association, who has made several efforts to see Paul and who has been turned away by the Rwandan government. There is only one way to obtain justice for Paul Rusesabagina, and that is for the United States, Belgium, and the European Union to prevail upon the Rwandan government to return him to his exceptional family. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have several questions queued up. The first question that we're going to take is from Rob Curran from the Dallas Morning News. And Corinne, I think that you can start out answering this question. And then if anyone has an additional answer, just let me know. Rob's question is, has the Belgian government explained why they are not publicly calling for Mr. Rusesabagina's release?
No, they have not explained it yet. And we are working with Belgian parliamentarians to ask those questions, to raise those questions in Parliament and to get answers. We need the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Justice to give us answers as to why a Belgian citizen was abducted and is being legally detained in Rwanda, and nothing has been said yet.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to add to that answer? Okay. The next question comes from Peter Verlinden from Nach Magazine. And it's a similar question, Corinne, so I think this one is also for you. To what extent has the Belgian embassy in Kigali been following the case? And does he get Belgian consular support from the Belgian embassy in Kigali?
We've had a couple consular visits thus far to Dad. However, in both of those visits, the two lawyers that were imposed to him by the Rwandan government were present, and the communication that we received from the consular's office was one that we believe was under duress and under pressure by the Rwandan government. So we are working very closely with the consular office, the Belgian embassy in Rwanda. However, we need more action. It hasn't been enough, clearly, and we don't know exactly what the current prison he's in looks like. We've all seen the article from the New York Times. We've heard we've seen what the room looks like. However, we still have absolutely no idea where he is now, what it looks like, what the inside of the room looks like, because we need the Belgian embassy to do more for us. Again, he's a Belgian citizen, and and actually any citizen that in any human deserves those rights to be not only visited by their country their country of citizenship, but also be given a fair treatment. And as of now, based on everything we've seen, there is absolutely no fairness.
Thank you. The next question, Anais, we're going to start with you, and then Peter, if you feel like we need to add to Anais's answer. But Reuters TV is asking, why do we think he has refused the recommended lawyers? And I just want to explain, he has not refused. They have been refused when they've tried to go see him. But Anais, if you can talk about his choice of lawyers, and then what happens next, what will we be doing next to try to make sure he gets the lawyers that we want him to have?
Thanks. So to begin with the whole lawyer question, we the family have been trying to get my father legal representation since the very first week that he was there. Unfortunately, the Rwandan government did not accept that. They rejected our lawyer, Gatera Gashabana, every time he's going to see my dad. What happened is that on September 6th, there was a press conference by David Rugaza claiming to be the lawyers for my father. We had not spoken to this person, and we had not heard from him. This person is a person who works for the government, the same government that kidnapped my father, the same government that want to judge him, that's found him guilty. So we do not know this lawyer, and we do not want to work with this lawyer because he does not want my father's best interests. But the most important thing is that we have selected lawyers that we know will defend my father, whether in Rwanda, in Belgium, but we want him to be out of there as soon as possible. And yet, the government does not want to allow this. So they claim that my father doesn't want his lawyer, but he didn't know. He didn't know because he has not had access to any communication, private communication with the family. In fact, they haven't even allowed him to see the Red Cross. So these lawyers that claim to be working for my father are fake. The family does not believe in them, and the family does not want them to represent our father. We have our team led by Pierre Robinson, who can tell you a little bit more about the structure. But what I can tell you is that these people claiming to be my father's lawyer are fake. They have been trying to take my father's attention from the beginning, even though our lawyers tried to go see my father way before they even claimed to be his legal representation. So please look at the date, look at the fact that these lawyers have not spoken to our family, and we do not believe in them and do not want the best interest of my father. I think Peter can also add a little bit more about the lawyers.
Anais, that's a very tough act to follow. You're so articulate. I think I can only add that Gatera Gashambana, the Rwandan lawyer who is the person our team would rely on to represent your father at the beginning, has defended 2 people already who have been charged with these kinds of offenses. And he was the president of the Bar Association there. And he has the courage and the experience to be independent of the Rwandan government. Unfortunately, there are very few lawyers in Rwanda who can do that. And that's why it's so important that we have a lawyer like that who can actually do something meaningful on behalf of your dad. Thank you.
And Peter, forgive me if someone already mentioned this point, but I think the point that the lawyers that Paul currently has are also being paid for by the Rwandan people. Can you speak to that a little bit, Peter?
Yeah, that's actually extraordinary in all countries that I know of, including the United States and Rwanda. If you can afford your own lawyers, you don't burden the taxpayers with paying for their defense. So I see this as a way that the Rwandan government is using to control all aspects of Paul's case, the prosecution, the judges, and his own lawyers. And since the family has the funds to provide legal representation for their dad, then there's no reason whatsoever that the Rwandan government should not be allowing that.
Thank you, Peter. Next, we have a few questions from Keith Harmon Snow, who is a journalist and has been studying the situation in Rwanda closely for years. He's got several questions, and I'm going to start with the easiest one first. Corinne, which year did the Belgians break into your house? Or sorry, did the Rwandans break into your house in Belgium? I know we were just talking about that the other day.
It happened a few times, but the first time was in 2009. They broke in, destroyed a lot of things, moved things around, and the goal was not only, they stole some documents, but we believe the goal was to intimidate us, but also to steal whatever documents that they left with.
And if I remember correctly, no computers were taken, no jewelry, no television. The only things that were taken were documents written in Kinyarwanda, correct?
That's correct.
So that was how we assumed that it was the Rwandans that broke in. It probably wasn't a run-of-the-mill Belgian thief who would be interested in Kinyarwandan documents.
That's correct.
And then Keith also was wondering what, as you've said before and can maybe repeat, that the conversations that you've been able to have with your father are very monitored and he hasn't been free to talk. But what has he said to you about how he ended up in Kigali and about his abduction? And if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, so when we spoke with him the first time, again, he mentioned, he first started off the call by saying that his 2 lawyers were sitting next to him. We immediately asked him about how he was doing, how he got to Rwanda, and he stopped us immediately and said, I cannot talk about the case. We obviously had many questions. That was the first time we heard his voice, and after 13 days of being legally detained, he stopped us from asking those specific questions, which just to go off on a tangent for a second, I find it absurd because they had many journalists go and see him, a couple of journalists go and see him and have been able to ask him much more questions than we as the family had over the phone with him. On the same phone call, he immediately went into a list of demands from his so-called lawyers. Once he started asking for specific documentations, while we continued asking about his well-being, his health, he told us on that first call that he had been denied his medication for several days, that his tension was high, and that he was actually at the max. On the second call that we had with him, the answers were even stranger because it's almost as if he was answering the same questions that we had asked before. Yet this time he was answering them in the way, by telling us answers he thought we wanted to hear. And still he sounded very odd. He sounded like he told us again that his lawyers were right next to him and that he couldn't speak freely. We asked specific questions about his well-being and how he got to Rwanda, and he still wasn't able to tell us, which is very strange.
And Keith, to a couple of your other questions, from what we've read from the journalistic reports in the New York Times and elsewhere, was the reporters who interviewed Paul also felt like he was under duress and perhaps not free to answer all of the questions freely. So we still have a lot of questions about everything, about how he got there, etc. And then, go ahead, Corinne.
One thing I would add as well is that we heard from the consular's office, we've heard as well that when they asked him how he got to Rwanda, he told them that he had woken up in Kigali. So that being said, we don't know what they did to him to bring him there.
So yes, just to clarify on 2 points, Corinne, when you said his tension was high, I believe you meant he takes blood pressure medication and his blood pressure was very high because he hasn't had access to his blood pressure medication, correct? And then he told you or the consular office that he got on a plane in Dubai and woke up in Kigali?
Yes, yes.
Great. And Keith, you also asked about cooperation of the Rwandan government, and Brian and Peter, correct me if I get this wrong, but the Rwandan government has said variously that they had international cooperation for Paul's kidnapping and illegal rendition, but then they had also backed off that and said that there was not any cooperation from any other governments.
That's correct, Kitty. They had at least 4 or 5 different stories. The first was there was international cooperation, and then both the UAE and Belgium denied that there was any cooperation at all. Then they had said that Paul simply got on the wrong plane and ended up in Kigali. President Kagame actually said at one point that the operation to get him there worked, quote, flawlessly. And one of the top generals in the Rwandan Investigation Bureau also mentioned that the plan had worked flawlessly to get Paul there. After that, when there was international pressure on it, they said that Paul had come voluntarily and that he was there by his own choice, and he just ended up in Kigali. Anyone who knows Paul knows that that's inconceivable that he would have gone to Rwanda voluntarily. He knew what would have happened to him. And then finally, they're now back to the idea that he was tricked to get onto a plane, and they've come back around to that story again the last we heard.
Thank you. And then we have some questions from Samba from the BBC, and I think we've answered a couple, but I just want to clarify that we have heard that Paul hasn't complained about the lawyers that he's had in Rwanda, but that the team member has tried to represent him and been denied. And Peter, if you could just clarify about Paul's situations vis-a-vis the Rwandan attorneys and our attorney, again, just reiterate about our attorney trying to visit him.
Yeah, it is true that Paul has not expressly expressed any displeasure with his lawyers publicly that we know of, or requested our family's lawyers to represent him. But we believe that that's because of the situation he finds himself in, where he's not free to read from a script other than the one that is being provided to him by the Rwandan government through his current lawyers.
And also, and maybe one of the family can talk about this, we have tried repeatedly through different channels to get him the message about his lawyers and been denied. Anais or Corinne or one of the family, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, I can take this. Yes, so we've tried numerous times to have a lawyer, Gatera Gashabana, visit him in Kigali, always denied. We've through the support of the U.S. government, we tried to pressure the Rwandan government to allow at least this minimal human rights to be able to see his own legal representation. And we've unfortunately haven't been unsuccessful. To this day, our father has still not spoken to Gatera Gashabana. And on top of that, the government, what we know in the past is they've done, these people that kidnapped him, they do to things to people in prisons that are bad. They torture them and they ensure that they cannot speak freely. So, when we see that and he speaks and he talks in the New York Times and he tells the New York Times what happened to him, and then is okay with the lawyers, are apparently okay with the lawyers that are forced on him. We know that this is not okay. We know that this is a work of the Rwandan government. This is how they've treated prisoners in the past. We have examples like Kizito, who was killed by the Rwandan government in the recent months, who also was denied his own legal representation. And that's why our family is very scared with this behavior of the government today, because this isn't the first time. And when we last saw this, the person ended up dead. So we want my father to stay alive, and we want to have him the regular, real representation that we have chosen to protect him and to defend him as soon as possible.
From, again, from the BBC radio and from a couple of the other questions that from France 24, the journalists are looking for some clarification about Paul's role with PDR, with the MRCD, and with the FLN. And Brian, if you could briefly explain those relationships and how the parties are intertwined.
Certainly, and I want to be clear from the start, this is not something that we've been able to talk to Paul about since he was in prison, but there's a lot of public information out there, and we've also spoken to a number of the other MRCD leaders, and we put together the big picture of how that party works. The MRCD, first of all, is, the Movement for Democratic Change in Rwanda. That is a umbrella organization, what the Rwandans call a political platform for the various parties in the Rwandan diaspora who are opposed to Paul Kagame. Paul Rusesabagina was the president of the PDR party. That's the Party for Democracy in Rwanda. It's a political party that focuses on peaceful change. Paul was an officer of MRCD by virtue of PDR being a part of that coalition. Very important here, and people aren't getting the full story on this. There was no central control in the MRCD. This is a loose group of parties that came together out of common interests and agreed to work together, but no party takes orders from the MRCD. The FLN was an armed group in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We understand from other MRCD leaders that they were formed in self-defense after Rwandan government and rebel attacks against Hutu groups in the Congo. The FLN joined the bigger group, the bigger coalition group in 2018. And very importantly, they were removed in July of 2020 because of the alleged violent actions that are out there. The FLN was accused by the Rwandan press of these attacks. We have no other outside information about these attacks, and we know that the Rwandan press tells the story that they want people to hear. So we are not even certain of the details of these attacks. But after the attacks became public, what we do know is that MRCD groups, other groups in the coalition, became very uncomfortable with the FLN, and they began a process to have them removed from the umbrella organization, from the MRCD. There were two memos that are public now from MRCD leadership in May and June of 2020, and then a final memo in July of 2020 that we've heard from behind the scenes. Paul was a leader in putting together these memos. The final memo announces that the FLN has been removed from the MRDC. To be perfectly clear here, Paul Rusesabagina was never in control, as far as we know, of the FLN or its actions. The MRC did not form the FLN, as has been suggested by the Rwandan government. Rather, the FLN joined the MRCD.
Thank you, Brian. And we have a question for the family in Belgium, especially for Lisa and Diane, and if you can help us understand. We've seen, this question is from Voice of America. We've seen in the past that a Belgian citizen, Father Guy, News, I think I got the name mispronounced, who was detained in Rwanda, but later allowed to stand trial in Belgium. He was a Belgian citizen detained in Rwanda and allowed to stand trial in Belgium. And how are we putting pressure on the Belgian government to ask them, while we believe the charges against Paul are false, if Paul is to stand trial on anything, why isn't he being allowed to stand trial back in Belgium like the father was allowed to?
C'est en fait ce que nous demandons au pouvoir de la Belgique. Nous demandons que notre père soit rapatrié, qu'on le ramène à la maison, parce que déjà les charges qui pèsent contre lui ont été déjà introduites ici en Belgique. Et les Belges ont vu que c'est un dossier vide. Ce sont des choses, c'est un tissu de mensonges. Ce sont des choses qui ont été collées les unes aux autres. Et du coup, lorsqu'ils ont vu que leurs choses ne marchaient pas et que tout le monde avait compris leur jeu, ils se sont dit, bah, on va le kidnapper puisqu'il est rwandais. Mais ils ont oublié qu'il n'était plus rwandais depuis déjà 24 ans. Et ça, ils ont oublié et ils le mettent de côté. Et ça, on voudrait que la Belgique et les autres, l'opinion internationale en général, nous aident à le ramener. Et s'il faut qu'il réponde à quoi que ce soit, il y répondra, mais en Belgique.
Great. And does one of the other siblings, Roger or Corinne, could you translate that for us in English, please?
Sure. So basically, Lise just said that those charges are the same. So there's already an open case of file here in Belgium. And because the Rwandan government has been trying to file false charges against Dad, and it's already based on the fact that the Belgian government hasn't arrested our father, there was no international warrant against him, and the Rwandan government continued to try to make up those false charges. Lisa saying that this is their methods of trying to get at us. Another thing is that they're trying to claim that he's a Rwandan so that they can try him in Rwanda. However, we've already made it clear that Dad renounced his Rwandan citizenship when he arrived in '96 and was granted political asylum. So this is essentially a strategy of the Rwandan government to try to silence people, to bring them back to Rwanda, to try them, to put them in prison so that they no longer have a voice against, they could no longer oppose the Rwandan government publicly. And that's why in relation to Guy Tanis, who was a pastor in 2005, who was arrested, the Belgian government brought him back and tried him here. Because he's a Belgian citizen. So we're asking the Rwandan government, the Belgian government, to do us the same favor and to bring its Belgian citizen back to Belgium. And if he needs to be tried, that he be tried here in Belgium.
Thank you, Corinne. And then for any of we've got another question really for any of the children and the people who know Rwanda best about what happens to prisoners in Rwanda and the fact that they are often drugged, poisoned, tortured, and is that likely to influence any of the questions and answers in the way when we've heard from your father publicly, do you think any of the things that they might be doing to him in prison might affect that? And could you talk about some of the things that the Rwandan government is known to do to prisoners? And Roger, maybe you want to start that one?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Kitty. Of course, going to prison in Rwanda, you lose all your human rights. I think people in the United States forget that. In the US, when you go to prison, you're still a human being. In Rwanda, you lose your human rights. So people, I've had absurd about people being tortured, people being dragged, people being abused, even their families outside the prison, people not being fed. In Rwanda, when you don't have a family member to bring you food on a daily basis, then you may starve. You may get fed once every 3 days. And So you're not getting a decent meal. So all those things may have happened. We don't know, or we assume they have. And to say that anything that our father said since he's been to Rwanda, it's hard to believe what he's saying because he's been kidnapped. His kidnappers are holding him. So whatever he says, they have to approve it. So any statement that he has made so far, even going to court with lawyers that you did not choose, that they work for the government, whatever he's saying, he has said so far, for us is, we don't believe it, So because it has to be, it's all been scripted by the Rwandan government, and so that's why we need to have his legal team go to Rwanda, get him out of there, follow the international laws, bring him to Belgium. If Rwanda has questions, you can ask. You're just gonna go through the proper channels. It's not that we don't want to answer questions, but you go through the proper channels. You go to Belgium, and they have done it before, and it has worked in some cases. So they should do the same this time. And that's why we're asking the international community to make sure to hold Rwanda accountable. All these countries that are donors and the millions of dollars to Rwanda, they can look at the Rwandan record since 1994, and it's not pretty. So that's why we're trying to point that out and make sure the whole world knows, and we do not expect any fair trial. Thank you.
And I'd also like to add to the fact that the United Nations Committee Against Torture has also reported that Rwanda tortures prisoners, and the Rwandan actual government has refused to corroborate and cooperate with the committee for them to continue investigation. So the Rwanda is actually hiding and does not want to allow the United Nations to visit their prisons on what they're being accused for. So this is not just my father, this is something the Rwandan government has been doing in the past. And in fact, they're actually hiding from it from the United Nations.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just also add that, so they've made him say publicly that he's being treated very well, but then why would you take him to the hospital 3 times? A person who's being treated really well and kindly would not be taken to the hospital to be treated for his health. So we believe that they are also lying about the way that they're treating him.
Exactly. They make him sound like he's happy to be there, which doesn't make any sense.
And
I have talked to Paul about this many times, and I've also read the Human Rights Watch reports, the Amnesty International reports, the UN reports. Rwanda is one of the 3 worst prison systems in the world, and he is in one of the worst prisons inside of Rwanda right now. These are by international standards. There are regularly reports about mistreatment of prisoners, and as the family said, the outsiders are not allowed in to see. But we hear reports of physical torture for higher level prisoners who are more visible. We hear reports of psychological torture, whether sleep deprivation or other things. One of the things that every Rwandan knows, quote unquote, and I've spoken to Paul about this many times and to people in the diaspora, when you are in prison in Rwanda, on the rare occasions that they offer you food, most Rwandans are afraid to eat the food or afraid to take any medication that they are given. Paul is a person who has a heart condition. He has hypertension. He is a cancer survivor. He is on a number of medications. And we in the family and people who know him best know he's going to have to eat and he's going to have to take his medications, but he's going to be in fear every second that he is doing that because he knows how the Rwandan government has been said to treat people in the past. It is really a quite horrific situation.
And I just want to add on the medication part and the fact that he went to the hospital. I was with him every day in Texas. I was with him from the morning to the night, and he never got sick once. He was taking his medication every day. He never had to go to the hospital one time. Even in this pandemic rate in society, he never had to go to the hospital one time. He was in perfect shape. And all of a sudden, he finds himself in Rwanda, where they say he's taking his meds every day. But he's going to the hospital. Just putting 2 and 2 together here, it's not very difficult. So.
Yeah, Kitty, if I could also add that I've been to many Rwandan prisons in my career, and conditions are not good and under normal circumstances. But now with COVID-19, it's a very difficult situation for all prisoners, including Paul. And I was actually quite shocked that his lawyers during all of the bail hearings has never once mentioned the COVID-19 as a reason for the bail for a person who is particularly vulnerable to that disease. And when you see people being released all over the world because of COVID-19 from these prisons, that seemed to me evidence that Paul was not being properly represented.
One related question about how he's being treated, and then we're going to hear from a special guest who's joined us. But the question from Sophie Neiman, who's a freelance reporter who's been following this story closely. The question is, do you fear that Mr. Rusesabagina might have been forced to make a false confession, as human rights groups have indicated have happened in the past? And that, I think any one of the family members can start off with answering that.
Absolutely. I mean, no doubt. He's being held against his own will. What is he gonna say? They give him the microphone when they want him to speak. So they make sure that he says what they want him to say. Or they make sure that he will say something that will not get him in trouble. So we believe that he's definitely being forced to say things that he may not say in normal circumstances.
Also, yeah, just the mere fact alone that not once have we been able to speak to him and him alone, just by himself, confidentially. Just should tell you something about what they're willing to let him say. On the phone, he sounds like nothing we know, like not the man that raised us. He's speaking against his interests every time he says something. He's speaking against his own very nature. So we just have to take all that in consideration, on top of taking all the prior examples that have happened before. But this is not new. As Brian said it, this isn't new. This is the same playbook that they play over and over again. And my dad is just the latest victim. So.
And I would also add, going back to the legal representation, this is the same government that kidnapped him. The president himself made him guilty. The judges are not even recognizing of the way he got there. And the lawyers that are working for the same government. My father is a very, very smart man. He's been fighting this government for over 20 years now. And, he knows that he wouldn't want to work with a lawyer who works for the same government, who is charging him and want to make him guilty and accusing him of these horrible charges. So when he says, and I read in the news that he said he likes his lawyer, I know for a fact that this is not true. I know he's being tortured to say that, because he will never want to work with people who want his life. And these people want his life. They've said it for many times, many years.
Great. We've got one quick question for Trezor or the family, but Trezor, can you talk about the last time that your mom spoke to your dad when he was en route to Dubai, and whether she knew that he was, did she know that he was going to be ending up in Rwanda?
Of course. So the last time they spoke, he landed in Dubai, and my father said he had peace. He was at peace. He was good. Let me just tell you something right now. My mom, of course, had no idea that dad would end up in Rwanda, and dad had no idea that dad was going to end up in Rwanda. Like, this is a place that he would never go, not in a million years, at least not right now. Not while we have the so-called president that we have right now. This is a place that he would never ever dare to go. So he was definitely kidnapped there. He was definitely snatched there. And I would also repeat the fact that that same government still hasn't even come up with one explanation, not one, of how he got there.
So your mom knew he was going to Dubai, but
not Rwanda. No, of course not. Of course not.
And then we've got a couple of legal questions that we'll get to in a minute, but we have Congressman Patrick Kennedy has joined us and would like to speak for just a minute. Kevin, can you make sure that he is unmuted? Here we go. Thank you, Congressman Kennedy.
Well, thank all of you. As a former member of Congress and author of the Accession to the International Human Rights court, which we got passed in the Rome Treaty but never ratified. I'm a big believer that we ought to stand up for human rights anywhere in the world. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I want to thank Paul's family for how they've held in there and fighting on their father's behalf. I want to say our country should stand ready to push this case internationally. The Kagame regime needs to be pressed on their human rights accountability, as we are doing in other places in the world, and the international community needs to step up. This isn't just a question of a leader in Rwanda for human rights. This is a question for all human rights. If this can happen, if the Rwandan government can go after Paul, no one stands a chance in Rwanda. This is one of the most celebrated human rights leaders in the world. And if they feel that they can do what they're doing to Paul with impunity, then we have moved back in a significant way in Rwanda. I just hope the United States does everything it can to put its pressure on Rwanda, and I'll do everything I can. I just want Paul's family to know that the Kennedy family stands with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Dresser.
Thank you so much, Congressman Kennedy. And Brian, if you could just put this into context, I think Congressman Kennedy really hit on something that's so important, that this is not the first person that President Kagame has done this to. This is not the first political person he's put in jail. He's been known for killing journalists, killing human rights activists, kicking human rights activists out of the country, killing people who he felt were disloyal to him. Can you put this in a little bit of context for us, Brian?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, what you're asking could fill or has filled books and books. But just to give the highlights, President Kagame, well before he was president, started to go after political opponents. It was 1995 and 1996, shortly after the genocide, when the Kagame regime had announced a coalition Hutu-Tutsi government, but it became very clear that Hutus were not welcome. And the prime minister at the time was one of the first people to be chased out of the country, and he was exiled after being brought up on corruption charges and had to flee the country. That continued for many years, and we've seen time and time again how it has happened. President Kagame took power in the early 2000s. The new constitution in 2003 effectively gave him the legal power to stop any political opponents that he wanted to stop, and to stop any dissenters. This is a regime that has been many times called a regime that is opposed to any dissent and stops any dissent inside or outside of the country. That's included the media. Local media have been banned. Local media owners have been killed and have been chased out of the country. It goes to the BBC. The BBC did a broadcast in Kenya, Rwanda, I believe the year was 2008 or 2009, about the genocide. And they simply mentioned the fact that Hutus had been killed during the genocide. That was something that was against the government story. And the BBC was banned in Rwanda that year. A major international news organization was banned. And then we get to political opponents, and it has happened over and over again in the 2010 election, in the 2017 election. Peter mentioned Victoire Ingabire, who was a candidate who came in from exile to run against Paul Kagame and was imprisoned very shortly after she came in from exile. Her American lawyer, Peter Erlander, came in to defend her, and he was arrested effectively for defending her and kept in prison in Rwanda for 6 weeks. There are American scholars and journalists who have gone into Rwanda and been put into re-education camps and have been arrested or pushed out of the country while they were there. Vice President of the Green Party, one of the most notable people there in terms of treatment, Andre Kagwa Ruzerka, was actually partially beheaded and found just blocks from his home. And it was taken as a warning and punishment to opposition parties. And then most recently in 2017, Diane was a presidential candidate who came back into the country to run for president, was arrested, and her mother was arrested too. That's a handful of the hundreds and probably thousands of people who have been arrested, who have been harassed, who have been tortured for expressing an opinion that is not the opinion of Paul Kagame and the Rwandan government.
Thank you, Brian. And we have one last question from Peter Verlinden. And if any of the journalists have any other questions, please put them in question and answer now. But Peter, and I think this is a good way to wrap up because it also takes us going forward. We've had a couple of big international legal groups, the George and Amal Clooney Foundation and the American Bar Association, say that they would help ensure that the trial was a fair trial and would monitor. Is there any such thing as a fair trial in Rwanda? And will there ever be any process by which Paul could stand trial in Rwanda fairly?
Well, the outcome of any trial in Rwanda won't be determined by the facts or the evidence, but will be determined by the will of the government. So in that sense, you can never expect the trial to be fair. But on the other hand, the more sunlight that's put on those proceedings by people who are monitoring it, and the more he can have bona fide lawyers who could raise all of the issues in those proceedings that would show the unfairness and show the innocence of Paul, that is a good thing. And so the best thing for us is that the United States, Belgium, and the European Union persuade Rwanda that it's not in their interest to continue to unlawfully detain Paul. And short of that, if he does have to stand trial, we would welcome the strictest scrutiny of those proceedings by anybody who could do that. Thank you.
One last question. Anais, if you, it's from Abdi with the New York Times. And if you could please tell us a little bit about some of the support that we're getting on the case, about the interest of members of Congress and the Senate and the State Department and other organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty.
Sure, thank you for joining, Abdi. So one of the main things that everybody in our communication with this organization and the government here is telling them what happened. What happened is my father was illegally kidnapped and is illegally detained today in Rwanda. And this is against world order. This is against what United Nations was set up for countries to respect international laws. And what these organizations are upset about and what the government is upset about, when I say the government, United States government, is that Kagame and his government, they decided not to abide for this international law and take my father under extraordinary detention. So the human rights organization like Amnesty International and others are calling this out. They want to make sure that people are aware that international order cannot be broken by a person like Kagame, because this is for world peace. And this is why we're calling the government to help us to keep world peace and world in order. And if people are allowed to just go and take a person from one country to the other and persecute them and illegally detain them, then this is the world that we don't want to live in. And when my conversation and the feedback that we're getting is this is not acceptable, and we should push it to make sure that everyone's aware of that we want to keep world order and not allow such illegal behavior happening.
Thank you, Anais. And thank you, everyone. Does anyone from the family have any closing words that they'd like to share? Oh, actually, we just got another important question. Sorry, this just in, breaking news. We know that President Kagame is in the United States right now. Do we have any way of reaching out to President Kagame, or do we have any messages for him since he's in the United States and we know that he's likely going to meet with representatives from the United States State Department. Anais or anyone else from the family, do you have any messages that you would like to get to President Kagame, either directly or through our State Department?
Well, I'm happy to start, and I think all of us have something to say. But the very first thing I'd like to say, bring my father back home, and we need him, we miss him. Please just respect world order and allow this to be continued. If he wants my father, please allow Belgium or United States to support you in that, but do not kidnap him, and please bring our father back home. That's my very first ask. And you know, my father is sick. He's a 66-year-old man with hypertension. He's a cancer survivor, and this is COVID time right now. And we all know what can happen. And we've seen many of our friends and family get sick, and seen many of our friends and family die. So I would want for the president to be cautious, because he's been very careful about COVID in his country. So now my father is there to please help my father and bring him back as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Anais. We also got one question about the aid and programs and businesses that are doing business in Rwanda currently. And I would just like to say that in coming days, you're going to be hearing more from us about that, but we will be calling on businesses that do business in Rwanda to stop doing business in Rwanda, on the Congress to stop giving aid to Rwanda, and on development organizations to stop the funding that they're putting into Rwanda until Paul is released from his illegal detention. Also, journalists, stay tuned. Next week, we expect to have more news regarding GainJet, the charter jet company that we believe illegally transported Paul from Dubai to Kigali. So stay tuned. I put Hotel Rwanda Foundation's website in the chat, hrrfoundation.com. We'll have more news there. We'll have more news on the Free Paul Rusesabagina Facebook page. And I think most of the journalists know how to contact us directly. We only want to traffic in truth. We want all of the truth about Paul's situation to get out. This is a situation that for the 15 years that I've worked with Paul Rusesabagina, we have been frightened would occur. He has been constantly harassed by the Rwandan government, both in the United States and Belgium, and as we traveled abroad. So while this situation was shocking to wake up and find Paul in jail, it was not surprising. The Rwandan government has been manufacturing charges against Paul Rusesabagina for at least 15 years, when the only real crime he ever committed was the crime of being a humanitarian, standing up for people's rights and seeking to have a peaceful world in Rwanda and the Great Lakes region for all Rwandans, Burundians, people from the DRC, all Congolese. He wants to create a situation where all of the people in the region can sit around a table and talk about peace and work out a peaceful and democratic future together, without violence and without fear of retribution. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be talking to you again next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good morning or afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.